on. Stop that fucking shit. Screen bullshit.
Dave, your mic's on.
Oh yeah. Sorry, man. I just can't get Zoom to behave.
Oh yeah.
No. That's how I talk to my computer, Mark. You should try it.
I just kick mine. I don't...
All right. And I'm gonna mute so I can curse really loud.
Okay, go
That's I'm sorry for you. Like big,
We have.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, I don't know. I could just sit here.
That's too close.
All I where I go. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, we have to go back there. Yeah, you got to take a lot. I'm thinking of regret. Yeah, I mean, there must be more countries. But yeah.
Good afternoon. Hello. Good afternoon. Hello, Zoomers. Thank you all for coming this afternoon. I have the distinct honor of introducing our speaker this afternoon in our yearly speaker series, Dr. Robert Metcalf. Now, the usual way academics introduce each other is to give this long pedigree of their education and their accomplishments. And yes, it's true that Dr. Metcalf has such a pedigree, including places like Vanderbilt and Penn State, but nah. I would rather tell you a story, okay? It's a quick story. It was the spring of 2000, so 23 years ago. And I can't say Dr. Metcalf, I'll just say Rob. Rob was invited to come give what's called a job talk. For those of you who don't know what a job talk is, it's when you're applying for an academic job and they invite you to come speak. And they're not just listening to the words you speak, they're trying to determine, is this somebody I could be a colleague with for over 30 years? Or, you know, it's a personality test. It's like speed dating. Anyway, the title of his talk was Socratic Elenchos' Philosophy. And I have to show you this. There are advantages to being a hoarder. These are the notes I took. No joke, these are it. And what happened that day was in the Haber Library, Rob gave this talk on Elenchos' philosophy, and some of us were blown away. I had been at the school for 2 years as a part-time teacher, and for some reason I had this sense that I had the authority to march into the chair's office, pounding on his desk. His name was Mitchell Abalafia, and I said, hire this guy. This is the guy. Now, I can't take full credit for the fact that Dr. Metcalf is here, but you all owe me a little something for the fact that he is with us. So what happened to us that day, as I remember it, is that we were blown away. We were floored by his presentation, not only because it was very interesting, but because he was funny and charming, and we liked him right away. And then what happened next is many years later, he published a book, 2018, and as I see it, you can ask him, this is the result of this lifelong project he was working on. It goes back to the paper Elenchos' Philosophy. So as I see it, Rob he's a bit of an enigma in my view. He is mild-mannered and kind, but I promise you, behind that facade lies the heart of the Dionysian satyr. Ready to light the fires, pour the wine, and yes, start the festival. In all seriousness, Rob has a unique set of gifts. He's exceedingly careful as a scholar, and yet he can be childlike and playful at the same time. In my view, he's a wise man, not just an accomplished scholar and teacher. He's courageously honest with students and in his writing. I mean, in the dedication page to philosophy as Egon, really, it says, "To my dearest and most cherished interlocutor from across the hall, Brian Lyle." I mean, no, he dedicated it to his parents. But you know, seriously, this book is inspiring. It makes you feel like doing philosophy is not only fun, but the most important work that you should be doing. As I see it, Rob is an inspiration. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Metcalf.
Well, thank you, Brian, for that introduction. And I tried to dress like a satyr for the for the talk today. And thank you, Jeff, for the invitation. I think students may sense this, but we have the best faculty in our department. And I've been so lucky to have these colleagues. It's a great place to do philosophy for students and for faculty alike. And it's something that we all feel a lot of gratitude for. So this paper is called Evil and Tragicomedy. And it's actually part of a much larger project on the problem of evil, on myth, like Platonic myth that we'll be talking about today, and tragicomedy as a kind of relationship to the problem of evil. But for the students, those who know me and also those who don't know me, I wanted to begin the talk in a bit of an autobiographical way. So I'll start in that way. Years ago, when I first discovered philosophy, I was drawn above all to its project of rational compulsion. The experience I craved was that of being compelled to believe, by philosophical texts or through conversation, what I did not believe before the encounter, or more exciting still, what I felt resistance to believing. The allure of philosophical thinking for me at the time was the allure of a philosophical ascesis, a self-discipline or training, that says, in effect, you are so self-indulgent, believing whatever it pleases you to believe, like some cultist. Who are you to manicure your own preferred set of beliefs and rest content with them, or even inflict them on others? The promise of philosophy was the promise of a discourse that would be a vehicle of rational compulsion, an academic discipline that is, at its heart, a matter of self-discipline, where the discourse is at the furthest removed from people just saying stuff, whatever half-thought opinions it pleases them to spout off, but is instead a rigorous disciplining of oneself philosophically, a shaping of one's soul, not unlike the soul writing that Socrates imagines in Plato's Phaedrus. This is not to say that I didn't have my own personal struggles in this endeavor. Because of my experience of having lost my religion, an experience that dovetailed ultimately with my discovery of philosophy, I had difficulty reading texts about God or sundry religious matters. My eyes would pass over the word God as if there were a hole in the page. But this just meant I realized over time that I needed to rise to the level of philosophical discourse and overcome my own personal impediments. Who am I to harbor an aversion that I have not yet earned? Maybe God is utterly remote from human sensibilities, as Xenophanes wrote, not at all like mortals in form or thought. Or maybe God is, as Aristotle theorized, thought thinking itself, not a person, but an activity, energeia is the Greek word, alive in the universe in some way, and thus a being which exists not at all like you or I exist as mere creatures of a day. Or maybe Anselm could compel me to believe that so long as I understand God to be that than which nothing greater can be thought, I cannot but conclude that God exists, that God necessarily must exist. I thought I knew what I was rejecting and letting go of belief in God, and I thought I knew who I was doing the rejecting, as if these are not themselves transformed through the ongoing ascesis of philosophical study. The discourse of rational compulsion exercises its allure most of all about matters that threaten your self-conception, where you have to risk something essential about yourself. It is precisely this risk and the mutual risk of participants summoned to contest one another in philosophical debate that gives to philosophy its distinctive thrill. As Nietzsche puts it in so many words, philosophy is written in blood. And so I was lured into Descartes' method of doubt in the Meditations, intrigued by the possibility of calling into question all my beliefs hitherto. And as part of that, I wanted to struggle against Descartes, to see if I could escape his conclusion that even if I am calling everything into question, the one thing I cannot call into question is that in the moment of questioning, I am thinking, I exist. With Nietzsche as inspiration in this work of questioning, I came to recognize that even that, Descartes' famous cogito, can be called into question. I mean, in the moment of radical questioning, in this moment that we are sharing together in thinking philosophically, there is thinking happening, but who am I and who are you? What I gathered from this time studying ancient, medieval, and modern thinkers like those mentioned is that the classic texts in the history of philosophy are incomparable collaborators in the practice of developing oneself philosophically, a practice that is in its origin and motivation deeply personal and self-directed. It is a work or exercise upon oneself and who one is through the collaborative thinking against and thinking with exemplary texts across the history of philosophy. For me, in my own writing, the texts that have been most challenging and most fruitful in this endeavor are those of the ancient Greeks, and above all, the dialogues of Plato. Plato's dialogues, dramatizing rational compulsion in various settings and from multiple perspectives, are imitations of what we ourselves experience through philosophy as discourse. And they are invitations to the reader to participate in this very thing, to be summoned to the risk and promise of self-transformation through philosophical discourse. Indeed, Plato dramatizes Socrates and other protagonists, drawing interlocutors into an exercise of reasoning which compels them to abandon their previous assertions, compels them to agree with conclusions following from what they have conceded, even if they are not yet fully persuaded by the conclusions reached. The perplexity and at times actual distress that Plato's characters express represent a genuine attestation of what the experience of philosophy should be, a risking of something essential about yourself through engaging the discourse of rational compulsion, with the standing possibility that you will be transformed in the process. Certainly your self-conception and hold on what you believe will be shaken if all goes well. Plato's portraiture of this core experience of philosophy is what makes his writings a literary treasure and enduring touchstone for philosophers in the next generation. Yet the dramatic portrayal of rational compulsion in Plato's text differs from the aims of rational compulsion in texts like Anselm's Proslogion and Descartes' Meditations in certain key respects. In dramatizing Socrates and other interlocutors in dialogue with one another, Plato is not offering a universal discourse aimed at compelling all rational agents. Rather, we find literary text focusing on the idiosyncrasies of specific characters, or the historical contingency, say, of his audience's self-understanding as Athenians, rather than, say, Cretans or Spartans and so on. All of Plato's dialogues imitate philosophy and invite us to participate in the discourse of rational compulsion. But at the same time, they allow us as readers of texts nearly 2,500 years old to occupy a distance or a kind of detachment from the characters so artfully dramatized by Plato. We're not Euthyphro, but we know his type. We're not Callicles, but maybe your roommate wants to be a Callicles. Nor are we necessarily fans of Pythagoreanism or sophistic relativism, like so many characters in Plato's text. By dramatizing so many different types of interlocutors with differing philosophical and political commitments, differing traits of character at different times of life, and so on, Plato affords us as readers not only a wide range of philosophical possibilities to contemplate, but the sort of engaged detachment that allows us to analyze the discourse of rational compulsion almost ethnographically, a model developed later by Aristotle in his topics, Sophistical Refutations and Rhetoric. Still, you might think that Plato's dialogues as literary dramatic texts are imitations of the experience of rational compulsion that, in various ways, fall short of that experience precisely insofar as they depict characters who do not articulate our own beliefs about the topics in question, who have moral and intellectual shortcomings that compromise them as any sort of exemplar, and so on. Indeed, it is a striking feature of Plato's portrayal of Socrates that even he, who one might presume to be Plato's intended exemplar, is called out time and again for various faults. For example, accused of being violent in discourse, this is in the Gorgias, of dissembling in how he presents himself in dialogue, it's in the Republic, it's in the Symposium, or mistreating the young men who are lured into philosophy. As inspiring and impressive as he is, Socrates is not perfect. He is not reason with a capital R, and he owns this. As he tells his comrades gathered around him on the last day of his life in his prison cell, what matters is not that he himself lives on past that moment, but that logos, philosophical discourse, lives on. Something which has lived on to connect us with our Greek predecessors and which will live on past us as individuals. Now, one of the most fascinating aspects of Plato's text is a feature of them that, like other literary aspects of the text, seems to depart often jarringly from what I've been calling the discourse of rational compulsion, and that is myth. These myths, which come in a variety of types, are some of the most memorable passages in Plato, and some are known of even by people who haven't read the text. For example, the famous allegory of the cave from the Republic, and the famous and controversial myths about judgment and the afterlife. These myths, while certainly memorable and entertaining, are no doubt disturbing to the reader who expects to be rationally compelled by the argument in the text. I mean, what is compelling about some made-up story, even if it is super interesting? In what follows, I'd like to focus on two myths in particular to locate the connection, or at least some possible connections, between Platonic myth and the discourse of rational compulsion, these two being the myth of from the Republic and Aristophanes' myth from the Symposium. What they share most importantly is threefold. First, both present a vision of the human condition that conveys metaphysical depth and gravitas. Second, the gravitas that belongs to each myth is in part a function of its addressing what in the history of philosophy has come to be called the problem of evil. That is, the problem of reconciling the evils that manifestly God or the gods have allowed in the universe with our expectation that God or the gods will protect human beings from such evils as worship would seem to presuppose. Third and finally, what is distinctive about these myths is their combination of tragic and comedic elements, thereby creating an affective relationship toward the problem of evil very different from the melancholy and lamentation prevalent in most philosophical treatments of this issue. And so in philosophy of religion, we study, Hume's dialogues and other great texts in the history of the philosophy of religion. And often there's a kind of melancholy that comes with discussion of the problem of evil. In contemporary treatments, philosophers will use examples like, well, what if a faun dies in a forest fire, but doesn't die immediately. It lasts for 5 days suffering until it finally dies. How can there be a God that allows that? And so the affective relationship toward this problem is, as you might expect, one of melancholy and a kind of lament that things are the way they are. As Socrates describes it in Republic, Book 10, the myth of presents a sight worth seeing, a vision that is pitiful and ridiculous and wondrous to behold. This complexity of myth in Plato's texts and their connection to the discourse of rational compulsion is what calls out for our examination. Let's start with the Aristophanic myth in Plato's Symposium. And on the handout sheet, does everyone have a copy of the handout sheet? There are, well, I have quotations from the Symposium, Aristophanes' myth in the Symposium, also the myth of in the Republic. There's also some Monty Python thrown in. Aristophanes' speech in the Symposium presents a mythic account of the human condition by imagining what human nature was like at the beginning. The most famous part of the speech, the etiological aspect of it, we might label it, is where Aristophanes claims that originally there were 3 kinds of human beings: male, male, female, female, and the androgynous kind, male, female. And that each of these 3 kinds were double what human beings now are, with 2 heads, 4 arms, and 4 legs, moving about the earth by doing cartwheels. Okay. But because these original human beings had great ambitions and tried to attack the gods, Zeus devised a plan to cut them in half so as to weaken them and make them more orderly, but also as a consequence, doubling the sacrifices that the gods would receive from them thereafter. While the myth is meant to illuminate the origin of Eros motivating all human beings, that is, the desire on the part of human shards like ourselves to weave together and grow together with another human shard, etiologically, the myth also serves to explain the differences between human beings who are heterosexual, those who are gay, those who are lesbian, and so on. The myth thus explains erotic longing in terms of the belonging of something to one's nature that has been divided from it, leaving one incomplete apart from it. Aristophanes' speech captures it this way. And so this is quotation number 2 on the sheet. And so when a person meets the half that is his very own, whatever his orientation, whether it's to young men or not, then something wonderful happens. The 2 are struck from their senses by love, by a sense of belonging to one another, and by eros. And they don't want to be separated from one another, not even for a moment. These are the people who live out their lives together and still cannot say what it is they want from one another. No one would think it is sexual union, that mere sex is the reason each lover takes so great and deep a joy in being with the other. It's obvious that the soul of every lover longs for something else. His soul cannot say what it is, but like an oracle, it has a sense of what it wants, and like an oracle, it hides behind a riddle. Aristophanes goes on to assert that what everyone wants fundamentally is to come together and be fused together with the one he loves, so that one person emerges from 2. Because, I'm quoting, as I said, we used to be complete wholes in our original nature, and now eros is the name for our pursuit of wholeness, for our desire to be complete. So we are split, we are human shards, and eros is that desire to be whole again, to be made complete. The myth is famous, of course, for its portrait of eros as a matter of seeking out one's matching half. But hand in hand with its idealizing of romantic connection between people is the somewhat disturbing extreme to which it leads, namely, what each of us wants, without really being able to articulate it, is to be made whole again by being fused together with or dissolved into another. This disturbing aspect of the myth is underscored in the section where Aristophanes imagines the god Hephaestus standing with his tools over 2 lovers lying together and asks them whether it is their heart's desire to become parts of the same whole, as near as can be, and never to separate day or night. Something that he could effect by welding them into something naturally whole. He says to them, then the two of you would share one life as long as you lived, because you would be one being, and by the same token, when you died, you would be one and not two in Hades, having died a single death. The myth thus portrays the telos of erotic longing as the eclipsing of one's own individuality by being fused together with another, so that one then has no life or death or afterlife existence of one's own, but would only have those things with another. But of course, according to the myth, none of us human beings living now after the fall of the original humans is properly speaking an individual. Rather, each of us is a dividual, an already divided human being, and we are threatened with further fragmentation if we should run afoul of the gods. So Zeus says, we'll just split them again. We'll have to hop around on one foot. You know? As human shards, we are incomplete and cut off from what would make us whole. And in this way, the fundamental longing to be made whole by losing oneself into another is at least intelligible. What is disturbing about Aristophanes' myth of Eros is it's reflecting the reality of what the gods have done to human nature, to punish us in perpetuity for our hubristic disregard of their power. The gods have inflicted upon us a form of suffering that we will try to heal, but never succeed in healing for the rest of our lives. You can see how this bears on the problem of evil. The grotesque image of Hephaestus welding lovers together into one whole recalls the earlier details of the myth in describing how Apollo reshaped the human body once Zeus had split them in two, as well as the subsequent transformation of the human body in relocating the genitals. Notice that Apollo was commanded by Zeus to turn the human face and half its neck toward the wound, so that the shard human would be aware of what he had suffered as punishment. Apollo then tended to the maimed body by smoothing the skin over the wound and cinching it together in the middle of the new front side of the body, as if with a drawstring, creating the navel. The navel serving as a reminder of what it had suffered, a relic of its incomplete and divided state. Of course, since for those of us reading the myth, the navel actually is a relic of how we were once connected to our mother's body, the myth is here in this specific detail, pointing once more to the individual status of human beings, gesturing toward the fact that however much we may take ourselves to be self-sufficient wholes, we come to be from out of other shard humans, and we owe to our forebears the very flesh that marks out our separateness from others. This initial reshaping of the bodies of shard humans led to a grotesque and pitiful display of erotic longing, which Aristophanes captures as follows. This is quotation number 3 on your sheet. Now, since their natural form had been cut in two, each one longed for its other half, and so they would throw their arms around each other, weaving themselves together, wanting to grow together. In that condition, they would die from hunger and general idleness because they would not do anything apart from each other. Whenever one of the halves died and one was left, the one that was left still sought another and wove itself together with that. Sometimes the half he met came from a woman, as we call her now. Sometimes it came from a man. Either way, they kept dying off. Then, however, Zeus took pity on them and devised another plan. He moved their genitals to the front. Before then, you see, they used to have their genitals outside like their faces, and they cast seed and made children, not in one another, but in the ground, like cicadas. Nice touch there. So Zeus brought about this relocation of the genitals, and in doing so, he invented interior reproduction by the man in the woman. The purpose of this was so that when a man embraced a woman, he would cast seed and they would have children. But when male embraced male, they would at least have the satisfaction of intercourse, after which they could stop embracing, return to their jobs, and look after their other needs in life. This then is the source of our desire to love each other. Eros is born into every human being. It calls back the halves of our original nature together. It tries to make one out of two and heal the wound. of human nature. So some remarks on this passage. First, the originating movement of Eros is the embrace of another shard human. But the original human beings in their fallen state were morbidly clinging to one another and dying off because they could not bear to be apart from one another, even to preserve their lives. So Zeus, recoiling from this catastrophe, took pity on us and relocated the genitals so as to maintain human beings in existence through sexual activity. First, it accomplished the reproduction of humankind by way of sex between male and female shard humans. And secondly, it was on account of sexual gratification that shard humans of whichever orientation could get some temporary respite from unfulfillable erotic longing. At least for a stretch of time after sex, shard humans could bear to be separate from their partner, get some work done, attend to the other needs of life. In this way, then, the benevolence of Zeus toward humankind amounts to his devising sex as a short-lived reprieve from the punishment he already meted out. Some temporary relief from the lifelong suffering felt by shard humans on account of their fragmented, incomplete state. And yet, Aristophanes' myth hardly counts as a theodicy in the traditional sense, a justification of the ways of God or the gods to human beings. While the myth as a whole is religious in character, concluding with its admonishing worship of the gods as the proper healing, upon examination, it's clear that human beings are presented in the myth as something like the domesticated animals of the gods. The Olympians need sacrifices from human beings, and it serves their interest to split us in two so as to double what they receive from us, so long as they can keep human beings alive and even devise their reproduction generation after generation. Whereas Socrates mocked Euthyphro's idea in Plato's Euthyphro that human beings relate to the gods in some transactional way, each party getting something out of the deal, here in this myth, the gods have put into place a very effective system of human husbandry where they multiply sacrifices made to them from here on out. If there is any art of the deal to be found in this conception of piety, certainly human beings are not the ones wielding such an art. So, and what is it that we get out of it? Suffering, the pervasive and relentless yearning to overcome this suffering. Sex as a temporary respite from this yearning. And finally, the obligation to worship the gods on threat of further punishment. That's what we get out of the deal. And so rather than it being a philosophical presentation of the problem of evil, offering a theodicy in response, Aristophanes' myth gives us a vision of the human condition with tragic and comedic elements combined in a way that is fascinatingly complex. The image of our original human ancestors, a doubled form of what we now are, doing cartwheels and reproducing like cicadas, but then split in half like a hard-boiled egg, and thereafter threatened with further splitting, well, that makes for some great comedy. Further, the divine gift that we receive to ameliorate our punished state, namely sexual gratification, is itself funny for all sorts of reasons. Certainly, the comedic possibilities afforded to us by sex were fully explored in Aristophanes' plays. And then I go on to quote some scholars as to the tragic character of this myth that Aristophanes is getting. It's both comedic, but it's also a tragic portrait. And I'll skip over that because I think it's clear from what we've been reading together. No, but how is it funny? I mean, if this take on the human predicament is supposed to be funny, it is at the very least open to the objection raised in a fragment of Democritus where he says, quote, "Do not laugh at the misfortunes of men, but pity them." Or then again, if we are dead set on laughing at our shared human misfortune, maybe we should turn it into a hymn like the one in Monty Python's film, The Meaning of Life. And so this is number 4 on the quotation sheet. "Oh Lord, please don't burn us. Don't grill or toast your flock. Don't put us on the barbecue or simmer us in stock. Don't braise or bake or boil us or stir fry us in a wok. Oh, please don't lightly poach us or baste us with hot fat. Don't fricassee or roast us or boil us in a vat, and please don't stick thy servants, Lord, in a rotisserie. It should be clear from the above that Aristophanes' myth presents a vision of the human condition that bears on the problem of evil, combining tragic and comedic elements. But how, to return to the question that I started with, how should we understand myth in relation to the discourse of rational compulsion? I mean, it's a super interesting myth, but what is this? Aristotle says in his Metaphysics that myth is composed of wonders. And this is definitely true of the Aristophanic myth. Beyond or because of its mix of tragic and comedic qualities, it is wondrous. And this wondrous character of it generates questions that the myth poses to the reader. Do I feel myself to be somehow incomplete in my being, driven by a longing for what I cannot articulate? Is my need for some sort of fulfillment through others even more basic than my need to attend to the basic requirements for staying alive? And how do specifically sexual needs figure into this more amorphous need for fulfillment through others? And is it a mark of the divine in human life that we are condemned to lives of restlessness? In Aristophanes' speech, Plato has given us a mythic lens through which to examine ourselves and work on ourselves, perhaps allowing for a kind of self-knowledge that we did not have before encountering the myth in this engaged form of reflecting on ourselves. Certainly, part of this practice of self-reflection involves questions about our own preoccupation with philosophy. Are we devoted to the self-discipline of philosophy because at bottom we are incomplete or fragmented, longing to be made whole somehow through the love of wisdom? Now, turning to the myth of it has to be said up front that the myth is bizarre, like psychedelically bizarre. And those of you who are familiar with the myth, you'll realize that I'm not giving a granular survey of it or thoroughgoing analysis. I just wanted to sort of relate in a distilled form what's happening in the myth of to what we've seen in the Aristophanic myth. So, in its most distilled form, it is a myth about the afterlife, where afterlife is understood cyclically as the time between reincarnations, along with the 1,000-year periods where one is rewarded or punished for how one lived the most previous life. So the story has it that was a warrior who was killed in battle, and yet he came back to life 12 days later while his body was on the funeral pyre. Related to others what he had witnessed in the region beyond human life, namely the judgment that is rendered upon souls after death, with heavenly rewards conferred upon the just and punishment in the underworld meted out to the unjust. And then they go on a 1,000-year journey, either under the earth or in the skies, before they return to the meadow to choose their life in the next reincarnation. Okay, and here in this meadow, they have models of lives laid out before them on the ground, and they're going to choose a model. So, to these souls gathered together in the meadow, Lachesis, the maiden daughter of necessity, says the following. This is number 5 on the quotation sheet. Souls that live for a day. Now is the beginning of another cycle of mortal generation, where birth is the beacon of death. No divinity, daimon, shall cast lots for you, but you shall choose your own daimon. Let him to whom falls the first lot select a life to which he shall cleave of necessity. But virtue has no master over her, and each shall have more or less of her as he honors her or dishonors her. The blame belongs to the one who chooses. God is blameless. Theos aitios. As the passage indicates, the choosing that happens in the meadow is not unbounded. Rather, one chooses from among the available models of lives, and one's cue in the line of choosing is determined by lot. So the one who draws the first lot has the least constrained set of possible choices, and the one who draws the last lot has the most constrained choice of lives. For example, as relates it, the first one to choose excitedly chose the life of a tyrant. dazzled by the prospect of extraordinary wealth and power, not realizing until after he had made this choice that his life would entail him devouring his own children, like the ancient myth of Atreus and Thyestes. Here we find the tragic character of what the myth reveals, human blindness as to what is entailed in this momentous choosing of one's life to come. In other cases narrated by the choosing happens under the hangover of what the soul had suffered in the previous life. Thus, the soul of Ajax chooses to become a lion rather than being subjected to the humiliation he suffered previously. The soul of Orpheus chooses to become a swan rather than endure being born of a woman in the next life. Talk about holding a grudge. I'd rather be a swan. And the soul of Thersites chooses the life of a baboon over that of a human being. There is comedy in these examples, and the comedy lies in the myopia that human beings exhibit in their choosing of lives, a myopia that one commentator likens to Aristotle's quip about people who identify happiness with health when they are sick, with wealth when they are poor, and with knowledge when conscious of their ignorance. Thus, according to the myth, our choices are constrained from the outset. We choose in part from the myopic perspectives of what we suffered previously, and we choose impetuously, dazzled by false appearances and without adequately examining what is necessary in order to choose well. The only example witnessed by of someone choosing well is Odysseus, the last one in queue, who ends up seeking over a long stretch of time just the model of life that he would have chosen if he had drawn the first lot, namely the life of a private or inconspicuous human being minding his own business. The Greek word for this is idiotes, which is the origin of our word idiot, right? So quite a choice from the epic hero after whom the Odyssey is named. Odysseus is a tragicomic figure whose example shows that even a heroic life as great as his previous life was, is less choice-worthy than the life of some random, unnoticed idiot minding his own business. In light of these various souls choosing lives of all different sorts, you could see why called it a sight worth seeing, to observe how the several souls selected their lives, a pitiable and ridiculous and wondrous spectacle. Socrates offers his own commentary on this story. This is number 6 on your quotation sheet. And there, dear Glaucon, it appears as the supreme hazard for a man. And this is the chief reason why it should be it should be our main concern, that each of us, neglecting all other studies, should seek after and study this thing, the ability and the knowledge to distinguish the life that is good from that which is bad, and always and everywhere to choose the best that the conditions allow, so that with consideration of all these things, he will be able to make a reasoned choice between the better and the worse life, with his eyes fixed on the nature of his soul, naming the worse life that which will tend to make it more unjust, and the better that which will make it more just. But all other considerations he will dismiss, for we have seen that this is the best choice for both for life and death. And a man must take with him to the house of death an adamantine belief in this, that even there he may be undazzled by riches and similar trumpery, and may not precipitate himself into tyrannies and similar doings, and so work many evils past cure and suffer still greater himself, but may know how always to choose in such things the life that is seated in the mean, and shun the excess in either direction, both in this world, so far as may be, and in all the life to come, for this is the greatest happiness for man. Now, if I had more time, I'd go through the various reasons why the myth of cannot be understood literally. That is, that the moral choice under discussion is in some literal way a prenatal choice that binds one over the entirety of one's life to the various implications, happy or horrible, of that single choice. I count myself among those readers of the Republic who read the myth in a this-worldly allegorical way, such that what is describing is not a choice made in the afterlife between reincarnations, but the choosing that we are involved in making at every moment. As one interpreter puts it, this fixing of attention on the present that you find in the myth, to which the eternal transitions of life and death come round, gives our myth its dramatic immediacy and Ur's message its urgency of purpose. So it's not really the souls in the afterlife who are gathered in the meadow. We are the ones in the meadow. And the moment of choosing is now. And indeed, our choosing of what our lives will be moving forward is a choosing in the midst of all sorts of constraints that limit our possibilities. And we carry with us the myopic perspectives ingrained in us from what we've experienced from life thus far. Anyhow, God is not responsible for what comes of the choice of life we're making. It's on us, right? That's the message at the end of Lacasis's words. Much more will need to be said to spare God or the God's responsibility for the evil stitched into human life, but let's save that wrestling with the problem of evil for another time. Understandably, we may feel ourselves recoiling from the moral freedom and moral responsibility being communicated in the myth. And on this point, notice what the messenger from that other world, says to the reader. This is number 7 on the quotation sheet. Even for him who comes forward last, if he makes his choice wisely and lives strenuously, there is reserved an acceptable life, no evil one. Let not the foremost in the choice be heedless, nor the last be discouraged. If we approach the myth of in the way that we approach the Aristophanic myth, namely as a vision of the human condition which brings together the tragic and comedic, and which is composed of wonders, as Aristotle tells us, then the myth can serve as a summons to self-examination, posing to us questions like the following. What are the constraints that limit my life choices from the outset? What previous experiences in my life exert pressure upon the life I might choose for myself? And what sort of myopia might an outside observer detect in me as I go about choosing a life for myself? What aspects of the life I have chosen make it acceptable, a life worthy of the affection that I and those close to me have for it? And what about virtue and happiness? How is the life that I can still choose for myself, the life that I am at every moment choosing among possible models of lives? How does it have the potential to be a life that is one of virtue and happiness? Seeing oneself in mythic terms there in the meadow, choosing one's life, and letting the wondrous character of the myth draw one into these questions for ongoing self-examination, that is how the myth does its distinctive philosophical work. So now I conclude on last paragraph. To return then finally to the question which I signaled at the beginning, what is the connection between the discourse of rational compulsion and Platonic myth? Given that myth would appear to be a departure from, if not a violation of, reason's own normativity. Admittedly, one is drawn into myth differently than one is drawn into the give and take of Socratic dialogue, and yet the draw of the discourse of rational compulsion, namely, I take it the possibility of being shaped or transformed by something apart from my own preconceptions and curated beliefs, is not unlike the draw of philosophical myth, which is to be drawn into a form of discourse composed of wonders that would set into motion a working upon the soul, a transformation of one's view in the encounter with something alien to oneself. A possible common ground between myth and the discourse of rational compulsion, I suggest, is philosophy as ascesis, a work or exercise carried out upon oneself, calling into question the beliefs that still reside in one's soul from a previous life, as it were. In the case of mythic discourses like the myth of or Aristophanes' myth in the Symposium, not believing in them in the way that we typically mean believing something, but rather using them as a lens through which we can examine ourselves using the tragicomic vision that Aristophanes and Socrates offer us as a means for seeing ourselves, questioning ourselves, maybe transforming ourselves. Using myth philosophically in this way is no scandal to philosophy. Might it not be a sign of profound insight on the part of Plato that his dialogues dramatize persuasion not only through the discourse of rational compulsion, but also by way of these extravagant, unforgettable, tragic, and comical myths? That's it. I assume I'll field questions. I know most of these. Try to run the Zoom. Okay, sure.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
while you were talking about the myth of Ur, I don't know if you play much video games, but I got this kind of image of like before you start a video game, you have like 5-7 different characters you can
Oh.
pick from, right?
Yeah.
And so that's where I have always kind of thought of there. That's what I was thinking of it as we're talking. But it seems you're suggesting more the myth is more like a maybe like a Nietzschean, like a radical authenticity sort of question, something where like it provides us the kind of tension to make choices now, how we're going to live the rest of our life.
That I'm glad you brought up authenticity. It has one of the most fascinating etymologies of any word. So it's originally a Greek word, authentes. And authentes means the one who kills with his own hand. So rather than have someone else do the dirty work, the authentes one does the deed himself, right? And what's fascinating about, or one of the fascinating things about the myth of Ur is that it's saying, whereas so much of Greek literature is about seeing the gods as responsible, or bad luck and so on, as responsible for my life as it is. The myth of Ur is saying, no, I am the one who is choosing this life, right? And there is a kind of fatefulness, a kind of fortune or misfortune that's part of that choosing of a life. So I can't, in choosing one life among the various models of lives, there's an opacity to the choice. I can't really see through all the implications of what I'm choosing. But of course, that is human life. I mean, we are at every moment faced with choices, the ultimate implications of which we can't see, right? But rather than say that there's some divine being who's brought down this horrible consequence, I'm the one who did this. So there is this moment of authenticity in the myth of Ur. I am taking into hand the weapon to do this deed, which is blaming myself, right? Holding myself accountable for the life that I've chosen. Yeah, sure. Other questions? Yes.
I'm not, this is kind of me just spitballing here, but based off what you just said in that myth, how can I be responsible for the choice I made if I'm not an individual? I'm just an individual.
Right. Yeah. So of course, those you're kind of bringing together the Aristophanes myth and the myth of Ur, right? But there's a way in which, I mean, I think it makes sense to kind of bring them together, or to see, to see some interesting connections between them, because we are, we're a product of the life that we've lived thus far, with all the good and bad that entails. And our choosing of a life is not without all sorts of constraints. I mean, I was born with red hair. Like, who would choose that? That's like the context for the possibility of my choosing. Your family members, you didn't choose them. You didn't choose to be born at this time with this native tongue in this historical situation, and all that. I mean, there's so much that is not a part of the choosing of a life. So this is the texture of constraint that we enter into already from the outset in choosing a life, right? So, I mean, I think what's interesting about the individual character is that it really is showing how this idea of some kind of self-sufficiency that we have, or that somehow we're the authors of our existence. No, we're inheriting a script, and we're making the best that we can with that script that we've inherited. I had this amazing experience years ago where I took my family to Oyer, Missouri, where there's a graveyard next to a church that my great-great-great-grandfather, Jack Metcalf, built. And there's a bunch of dead Metcalfs, and they're my direct ancestors. And so, you know, I made my son like sit on my lap as we're here, like among all these dead Metcalfs. He's like, "Dad, why do you do this?" But you know, what's interesting about something like that is that, you know, we owe our existence, we owe our flesh to these like specific human beings. And there's a lot that goes into, we're freighted with a kind of tradition that that brings in tow all sorts of constraints, some of them welcome, some of them not so welcome, to the life that we are choosing for ourselves. But what I see in these ancient texts is a recognition of that, a recognition of our finitude, our thrownness, as you know, Heideggerians say. And I mean, philosophically, it's really important to come to terms with that. Sam, you had a question?
I mean, in reading the book, and so on, don't get to. And I'm struck by how remarkably democratic it is, and how odd that at the end of this, you know, diatribe against democracy, democratic. But suddenly all these individuals are being authentic at this moment. Sure.
And it's determined by law, which is like, you know, so Athenian democracy was, well, on the one hand, it was a very narrow slice of the population that even, you know, had rights. But within that narrow slice, it was democracy by lot. So you would hold public office if your name happened to come up in the lottery. I mean, it's really bizarre you know, from our perspective. But this, you know, people have talked about that really interesting aspect of your place in queue by lot here in the myth of because it brings back the question of democracy and a kind of democratizing of our human situation. You know, we're all in this together. That, I mean, the other thing that's really interesting, that just the dramatic context of the Republic, it takes place between the Piraeus and Athens. It's actually it's the exact location where the Democrats fought the 30 tyrants in the Civil War. So it's about Athenian democracy. You know, Plato's family members were among the 30 tyrants. And so there's this family drama for Plato in terms of what happened at that time. So it's a very rich way of thinking about, thinking about this democratic place and the meaning of democracy here at the end of the Republic. I think you're right about that.
But also the role of virtue of that. The choice, even if you're Odysseus choosing last, he's choosing wisely. And if you're choosing first, you might choose. If Mino is choosing first, it's going to be gold, silver, honors in the city. And he's going to die on campaign.
I don't know if I included this one quotation. Yeah, look at number 8 here on the quotation page. So, yet if at each return to the life of this world, a man loved wisdom healthily, so to do philosophy in a healthy way, and the lot of his choice did not fall out among the last, we may venture to affirm from what has been reported thence, that not only will he be happy here, but that the path of his journey thither and the return to this world will not be underground and rough, but smooth and through the heavens. What's interesting there in that, this is Socrates speaking, and what's interesting in that passage is that he gives, rather than just saying, well, it doesn't matter what your place is in the queue, right? It may be the case that the constraints that weigh upon your choosing of a life may rule out a philosophical happy life and so on, right? So, there's this debate in the scholarship as to whether Plato held to what's called the sufficiency thesis, which is that virtue is sufficient for happiness. And oftentimes this is contrasted with Aristotle, who in Nicomachean Ethics seems to be saying that actually there's this tragic possibility for every human life that virtue is something that I can make sure my life holds to through the practices that I cultivate, through the virtuous dispositions of character that I work on. So virtue is something that I can do, but Aristotle says, actually, there are things outside, they're really things that come from outside our ability to choose or our ability to do of ourselves that may preclude happiness. Happiness is contingent on stuff not within your control. But here in what Socrates says in number 8, it doesn't say that explicitly, like he's not beating you over the head with it, but it does sound like he's saying that if your lot is among the last, then you might not be in a position to choose the sort of life that would bring about happiness, that would bring about philosophical fulfillment and so on, which is much more what we tend to associate with the Aristotelian view, right? Gotcha.
So I have a starter question because I have my own question, but there's a question from Zoom. Well, so this comes from David. I understand the alternative to rational compulsion that myth provides for reflecting and reasoning out important issues. What kind of tension within remains for you between those two different ways of seeking truth?
What kind of tension? Hey, thanks for the tough question, by the way. Well, I mean, I think I guess I want to be selective in the myths that I appropriate and that I want to use as a lens through which to examine myself in my life, because we've inherited some pretty bad myths. Right? Not all myths are created equal, right? There's some bad ones out there, and so the myths. I mean, on the one hand, I think we need to critically evaluate like what's going on in each of these myths that we are reading here in Plato or other authors, asking, well, is this the sort of myth that we can appropriate philosophically and use as a lens in the way that I'm suggesting? Because Plato does have myths. The myth at the end of the Gorgias is like this. It's a pretty brutal afterlife judgment that he offers. And for those of you who grew up in religious traditions, there's something grimly familiar about this kind of myth. On the other hand, is the myth saying what that myth that we've heard before is saying? I mean, we want to be able to critically evaluate it and say, is that what's going on? For one thing, something that really bothers a lot of readers is that oftentimes in a Platonic dialogue, you have all this sophisticated argument for 100 or more Stephanos pages. This is a long text, at the end of which we get a crazy myth. Like, what is that? So what I want to say is that that we have to really take seriously the work of seeing, is this myth something that we can use philosophically? Does it actually go along with the philosophical arguments that we have been tracing in the text? And there's a lot going on in that. So I guess I would say, to David's question, that the tension is real. I mean, it's something that requires philosophical work on our part, interpretive work to figure out how does this myth go along with the discourse of rational compulsion? Is this a myth that we can use in the way that I'm suggesting? Right.
David stole my question. But to kind of piggyback on that, I took a class years ago and the teacher said it was on Plato myth. And the teacher gave what I thought was kind of a lame description saying, you know, Socrates would use a myth when he thinks the interlocutor just doesn't understand what he's saying.
Yeah.
And then by the end of that course, we started talking about other myths in various texts. And I'm wondering if you can connect it to your favorite topic of Elenchos. I'm wondering if you can, when you say rational compulsion, I'm wondering if that's almost a synonym for that. Or in a way, the myth can yank you out of your maybe misunderstanding of a rational description that Socrates might give. And then when it yanks you out, you have a discussion and you can perhaps go beyond the misunderstanding that the character was stuck in, like Callicles in the end of the Gorgias, when Socrates gives the example of the 3 jars.
Right.
Although, I mean, I think the great part of that is it doesn't work. And you see that Callicles is just a shithead and people never get it.
Right.
And
That is true. Now, I mean, yeah, I definitely think that we don't want to end up saying, well, myth is just kind of turning from the philosophical audience to a non-philosophical audience and saying, okay, well, anyhow, you should be afraid of hell. That's the takeaway, right? I mean, one thing that's fascinating about images and myths as a kind of image, or you know, a structure of images, is that they stay with you. They stay in your memory, they stay in your soul in a way that argument doesn't. It's actually really difficult to remember, like, what now, how does Socrates refute Thrasymachus? How does it go? Like, you can reconstruct it, you know, and you know, you found it persuasive back then, you reread it, you're like, yeah, I find it persuasive. But it's actually hard to have those arguments stay with you in a way that the allegory of the cave you will always remember.
or the ring of Gyges.
The ring of Gyges, the noble lie, the myth of Ur. There's something about these myths and the potency of images in Plato's writing that the images burrow into your soul. And they stay with you in a way that you come back to them and you think about, wow, the allegory of the cave, I love it, and I can come back to it and I can think about it again and maybe revisit it or rethink what the implications of that are.
Do you think that actually happens in the dialogue though, where the character who didn't understand the description is then changed by the telling of the myth or the analogy, and then the dialogue can progress because now Socrates has other images and stories to tell, and therefore it contributes to what you're calling rational compulsion? Or is it just alternate styles that he's throwing out to see what works?
I mean, I don't know of a single myth that actually operates that way. Like, you know, you have this, the difficult interlocutor is like, oh, well, now I just needed to hear the crazy story. Now, I mean, I think maybe a possible counterexample is Protagoras's great speech in the Protagoras. So he tells a myth, and it's developed philosophically after the speech in a way that the myths that Socrates tells in the dialogues really aren't. You know, so there's that one exception, I think, to, I mean, another fascinating thing, you know, I began the paper kind of talking about, you know, why I find Plato's dialogues to be such a great philosophical resource for us, you know, over our lives. One thing that's really fascinating about the dialogues is Plato's attention to non-persuasion, right? You know, the Gorgias is maybe the best example of Socrates just failing to persuade these 3 interlocutors. And it's not like Plato decided, oh, you know, to hell with it. I can't actually, I can't have this be the dialogue. I mean, Socrates fails to persuade, and that's part of what Plato wants us to grapple with as readers, right? Yes.
Do you think the moment we experienced angst is connected to the use of it?
Angst. So say more about that. That's interesting.
I'm just learning about existentialism,
Hmm.
and Brian urged me for the whole class to try to push you to talk about Heidegger.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I mean, that's a super complicated question, but one thing that I brought up earlier in the paper was the kind of distress that Plato's characters express in the dialogues. This isn't, later in the history of philosophy, we have writers of dialogues, Hume, Augustine, we have a number of, Berkeley, we have a number of philosophers who wrote in dialogue form, but they tend not to show the wide range of emotional response that Plato has in his dialogues. I mean, Hume's dialogues are pretty good with a sort of emotional response, but much more so, Plato's dialogues show this. And I think that angst is something that's expressed in various points. In the Meno, we have this famous description of being stung as if by a stingray by Socrates' questions. It's not quite the same, but in the Republic, there is this account given of how all of us from our youth, we carry around with us dogmata. We carry around with us these teachings, these opinions that we've inherited from our culture, from our society, these dogmata that we revere them in the way that we revere our parents. I mean, they're absolutely critical to our own self-understanding. And yet, when finally the young people carrying with them these dogmata encounter Socrates and Socratic questioning, they're going to go through some things, as Trump would say, right? They're going to go through some things because they end up not believing what they had believed beforehand. And that's the moment of a kind of distress, a kind of angst, right? And I think it's so important, right now, Florida is, passing legislation to try to keep students from feeling uncomfortable about issues like, the history of racism in our society. Like, how can you even understand the history of our country without, grappling with that? But Socrates is the anti-DeSantis in a way. He's saying that, like, the whole point of education is to undergo a kind of distress, right? And not only that, this is for the good of our souls, right? It's not that there's some people in society who want to make you upset. It's we become better through this transformative process of dealing with the questioning and going through a kind of angst, a kind of distress as part of that.
These myths send me into a state of angst.
They what?
They send me into a state of angst.
Oh, tell me about that.
The idea of having to choose my life is a bit of a bummer.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there's a way in which Socrates in the myth of is almost an existentialist. If existentialism is echoing Sartre. So
Aristophanes seems pretty existentialist in mind.
yeah, no, I think you're right.
Split by the gods, and I can't do shit about it.
Right. Yes, but this, I mean, what is Sartrean existentialism? It is freedom and responsibility, and that's really what is being communicated in the myth of Now, freedom here is not, it's not just free floating freedom. We are free in the midst of all sorts of constraints, but no one else is choosing this life for us. Right? It's on me. At the end of the day, I can't say, well, damn it, my parents, yada yada, and actually my grandparents, at the end of the day, it's on me, it's on you, it's on all of us to kind of come to terms with that bummer that you're talking about, which is that, yeah, no one else can do this. Only I can choose my life. Yes, go ahead.
It almost, like you're talking about in Myth of Earth, seems like the people who have not had the turning of the soul or the finding of the wisdom are trapped in the cycle of choosing the next life and choosing the model life of the tyrant, rather than somebody whose soul was turned, finding that they would choose the life of the person who would have wisdom again and again. And it almost seems like to fall into wisdom is like this cycle of a permanent better.
Yeah, I mean, one really interesting detail of the myth is that people slow down their choosing having suffered in the previous life. That is, they're primed to choose better because it didn't work so well before. Whereas, the first guy that we talked about who immediately chose tyranny, he had been virtuous in his previous life, but without philosophy. That is to say, he didn't think through what's involved in trying to link up virtue and happiness and so on. And so he had it easy. He leaped at the prospect of a tyranny, not thinking through what's involved. So I mean, I admit that there's this bummer aspect that you brought up about the choosing, but one silver lining in a way of it is that, okay, we've suffered, right? Our lives thus far have involved some suffering. That's the previous lives as I read them. But through that suffering, we're going to make, fingers crossed, a better choosing. Right. So that suffering and the hard knocks that we've taken in life they're priming us to choose better, maybe choose like Odysseus is choosing. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks for the paper. I'm really worried about bodies.
Yes.
And I'm worried on a number of levels. Worried about the wound of the navel. I'm worried about the way reproduction has become internal to someone's body. I'm worried about this guy who chooses badly because he didn't have philosophy and then devours the next generation.
Oh, yeah, that's bad.
Right? It wasn't his body who suffered that act of generation or these acts of generation. And I'm worried about the gods wanting bodies for sacrifice, right? It's not the soul. The soul's got a sort of durability to it. It's the body that has to be regenerated through the generation. So I'm wondering about, I agree with you about, or I agree is a weird word here, but I'm really appreciating the other argument and resisting, I hear you, resisting the thing, that's for the kids, or that's for people who don't get it,
right,
or that's right, you're saying, no, there's actual philosophical value in these things, so we're not going to discuss them, they're images for children or women, right?
Right.
But I'm worried, I guess, about, and I have this both worry and concern about the existentialism that you named too.
Yeah.
Where it's there's this constant sacrifice of bodies, this constant disavowal of the need for bodies on both the philosophical side and the mythical side that are absolutely essential for the reproduction of this whole thing through the generations, the 2,500 years, right? That are just the disavowed matter. I mean, I've never felt more like a race.
Right.
What is
my work is done.
Right? What is that case?
Yeah.
So do you, are you thinking about this? Because when it comes to evil, right? We're willing to say, right, we have to choose our freedom unless we put it in a situation which we cannot choose. And then that's an easy thing to us. That's the question. So I'm wondering about how those issues fit into the project.
Yeah, I mean, I need to hear more from you to have a more adequate, conversation about it. But so there's a way in which when we talk about the problem of evil in Greek literature at this time, first of all, we're not dealing with an omniscient God, an omnipotent God, omnibenevolent God. The Greek gods,
Yeah, Hephaestus is like, I'll make y'all.
right, right. So it's more like there's this problematizing of evil in Plato's text that in a way it prefigures what we call the problem of evil down the road, right? And the myth of is, many people read it as a kind of proto free will defense of God, or sparing God responsibility, because okay, there really isn't yet a conception of free will in Plato. But on the other hand, there's the stressing of the fact that we are the ones choosing. This is on us, so we can't go off and blame God, for the evils that we have in our lives, right? On the other hand, this idea of free will, it doesn't account for what philosophers call natural evils, which really are evils stitched into materiality, into the body, right? So, so my grandfather was a terrible alcoholic, and he caused great suffering to my grandmother, to my dad, and his twin brother. And he was the one who actually took care of me when I was real little. I mean, you couldn't have a kid who thought more of a grandparent than I thought of my grandfather. I just love the guy. Passed away when I was 8. And it was only like around the time that I finished high school that my family actually told me about this kind of dark truth that had been there in the family for so long, which is that his alcoholism was terrible. It used to be the case that we would think of that sort of addiction in terms of moral evil, that human beings making bad choices and so on to inflict this evil on themselves, evil on others. Nowadays, we're in a better position to understand that this just is part of the evil that is stitched into materiality, that for so many people, an inclination to this kind of abuse just is there in the body, and it's transmitted from one generation to the next, right? So there's this, you're pointing to the complexity of the problem of evil that we're not even really touching in a way in terms of the myth of I think the Aristophanic myth is pointing to it much more than what we're getting in the myth of because how to read what the gods did to us in Aristophanes' myth. I mean, one way to think about that is just in terms of how those divine powers, whatever they are, that gave to us bodies of this sort, also gave to us unfulfillable longing. It gave to us the various evils that are stitched into bodies, right? So I think that we can connect the problem of evil to these issues, and also in terms of the Aristophanic myth, that there's a lot more work in teasing all that out. Yeah.
I just wrote for me, like regarding free will and choice and answer comes of being able to choose, it's more scary not to be able to choose, and this gives me appreciation for that choice and excitement in order to choose that in the basic existentialist sense of personal freedom. When you create that false dilemma of total restriction or complete freedom, I sprint towards freedom without hesitation. And in that moment, it alleviates any anxiety in that freedom. So being restricted from choice is far scarier than the potential for the bad to potentially come out. Free will should be exciting because of an almost nihilistic question I proposed. Would you rather be optimistic and wrong or pessimistic?
I love that you composed that during the discussion. I mean, but actually, it's actually a great illustration of how writing is part of thinking, right? I mean, like, we're here together, we're thinking through these issues together, but you're giving yourself the space to write that, to compose that as a response. It's perfect. Well done.
You're not gonna answer.
Well, actually, if you send me a copy, I'll be able to respond better.
Well, should we let him off the hot seat?
So there is a speaker event next week, right?
Yes.
So,
Yeah, Monday, 3:30, in the Haber Library, Joe Ulatowski.
oh, okay.
On experimental philosophy and analytic philosophy.
Yeah, I know.
Gotta go. Thank you. It's so fun to hear you. Your thing. I would love that, yeah. You're having a good snap.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like